Hello, everyone, and welcome to Encounters USA. We're in the middle of a series on U.S. hotspots, specifically the Hudson Valley in New York State. Today, however, we are going to break from our regular programming, as they say, and talk about a subject that is as relevant to the Hudson Valley story and is the whole reason for Encounters USA in the first place. Now, let me just ask you a question. If somebody came to you that you didn't know and said, I worked on UFOs. Not only did I see a UFO, but I worked on UFOs. I know how they work. I can tell you how they work. Now, what would be your first reaction? Well, that is what the subject of this podcast is about. And it's also about a book that I wrote, and it is about how we are conditioned by the government to think certain ways and to look for certain things that the government puts out so that we never really ask the right questions. So if somebody comes to you and says, I worked on UFOs, the first question you're going to ask is, how credible is this story? And you're not going to automatically come out and call this person a liar. I mean, depending on the person, the history of the person, et cetera, et cetera. But the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to look into this person. So if the first impressions you get from the person cause you some doubt, of course, you are going to look a little bit deeper. And so this very same thing happened to a reporter in Las Vegas in the 1980s, when a young scientist came to him and told him this wild story of how he was working on UFOs. Now, being a young reporter, he didn't do what a lot of us would do, and that is, thanks to the conditioning of our government and the media, is just to write this person off as a lunatic because we don't have the investigative resources to check the guy's account out. So according to what we have been taught to do, and part of a skeptical process and part of a thought process that keeps us from asking legitimate questions and looking at legitimate proof and coming to our own conclusions, most people wait for the government to come out and tell them what the truth is. So before we continue, I just want to explain to you why this podcast and why the Bob Lazar story is so important. Now, it's not only important for Bob Lazar and the UFO community, but it is also important because the thing that happened to Bob Lazar is the same thing that happens to almost every person that comes forward that has an encounter with an UFO, maybe with an alien, maybe an abduction, maybe they've seen a Bigfoot, a dogman, et cetera, et cetera. If the government says it doesn't exist, then there are certain things that happen, and those things we're going to talk about today because the things are always the same. So if the government doesn't tell you it's true, then the minute you come out and say something that does not agree with the government story, then, as we know, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble. Now, unfortunately, in our day and age, what the government says is most often not true. And unfortunately, most of the things that the government says that are true, in fact, our whole version of truth, is decided in corporate boardrooms, in back rooms of government offices, and in the fake media in editorial rooms. And that is where our truth is decided. And don't let me forget the intelligence in back rooms in the intelligence agencies. So all of these things make up their version of truth, and they try to sell it to the American people. And as I said, their version of truth is very often not the truth at all. But anybody who comes forward and disagrees with them, as we see, is going to be attacked. So, if you'd like to know more about how it came to be this way, how we came to be taken over by what is essentially the intelligence communities and the corporations, then you should read my book, Deceptions of the Ages, Mormons, Freemasons, and Extraterrestrials. But for right now, that's not really the topic of this discussion. The topic of this discussion is Bob Lazar and his incredible story and how the public was brainwashed into reacting to it. So before we go any farther, let me just say this before, because I don't want to go down the same road as every other person that has talked about this story. I am not going to muddy the water with the fact of whether or not Bob is credible. All right. I'm just going to tell you the story of Bob. I'm going to tell you the story of the recently released Bob Lazar movie. And I'm going to tell you why what happened to Bob Lazar is so important to each of us. And none of these things have been talked about when it comes to Bob Lazar. Now, the first thing that we need to get out, make clear, is that Bob Lazar is a man who says that he worked on UFOs at Area 51. Now, the question is, if somebody came to you and said that, then you would have a reaction to it. Now, if it's somebody that you didn't know, then you would have a certain reaction. If it was somebody you did know, then you would base your judgment upon how credible this person was. And if this is somebody you knew for a long time and you never knew them to be deceptive and that they fit the characteristics of somebody who could work at a place like Area 51, and there are a lot of things that go into getting a job at a place like Area 51, which we're going to talk about. But if a person came to you and said that, then you would make your judgment, and you would make a judgment a lot faster if this was a person you were familiar with. But most people are not familiar with Bob Lazar, and although most people are familiar with his story, most people never got to the point of ever asking, what about these UFOs that he saw? Now, if you were one of these people that came forward or not came forward, but said, wait a minute, what about what he's saying? Let's hear about what his story is. He's got some really good information about how these propulsion systems work because he says he worked on them. And let's listen to what he says and let's see if his story is just absolutely fantastical. And let's make our judgment from that. But again, this never happened. It didn't happen with anybody except for a small group of people who, if they came out and said that, were immediately labeled UFO conspiracy theorists. And again, go back into my book to understand where the term conspiracy theorist came from. But that's the fact, that anybody who made it all the way through the slander and calling him a fraud and attacking him and putting out every false story you could imagine, the people who made it past that and said, wait a minute, what about what he's saying? Isn't that important? I mean, what if it's true? Well, once again, there's lots of incidents of this happening because of our government and its tendency towards trying to keep these things covered up. Well, a lot of people that would have looked into this were just too scared away and too easily convinced that this man was a fraud. And it's how that process took place that we really not only need to be worried about as it happened to Bob Lazar, but that process can take place where each of us are concerned. And just remember one thing. If it happens to somebody else, it's somebody else's problem. But when it happens to you, it's the most important problem in the world. But to everybody else, you're just somebody else's problem. So until we get past that line of thinking, people like Bob Lazar and other people who are seeking the truth to things like alien, dogman, and UFOs are never going to get anywhere. All right. So, why are we talking about Bob Lazar today? We're talking about Bob Lazar today because Bob Lazar was the subject of this new movie that came out. I believe it was I'm not sure if it was 2019 or 2018. I want to say 2018, but it came out recently, and I've not had a chance to talk about it. But Bob Lazar's encounter is one of the greatest encounters in the history of mankind that we know of. So that is why it's on Encounters USA. And the fact that I'm doing it now in front of my, or in between my series of hotspots series, is because it is so relative to this hotspot question, especially in the Hudson Valley, which, as we saw in the last podcast, J. Allen Hynek wrote a book about the Hudson Valley, the guy who headed Project Blue Book to talk about UFOs. And that doesn't establish the fact that there are really UFOs. Isn't that disclosure? Well, let's just go ahead and move forward, as they say, and let's look into this question. So this is what we need to talk about first. First of all, we need to establish a timeline, because there's a bunch of ways to approach this, but the best way to approach this is let's just look at the timeline of what happened according to, the popular media. Everybody who was watching this story back in the 1980s, I think it broke in 1989. And so this is what people basically is common knowledge, as they say. It's what's in the popular culture. All right. So the first thing that we want to establish is that Bob Lazar is a scientist, and he has a history of working in different places that qualify him to be a friend of, according to Bob Lazar, and I'm sorry if I'm wrong, but I think he is a friend of Edward Teller of the atomic bomb project. And of course, Edward Teller, if it's the right person, it was a very important person on the Manhattan Project. And he was instrumental in getting Bob a job, I think, at JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So Bob gets a job at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He's a physicist. And he wouldn't have been a friend of Edward Teller if he was not a physicist and able to speak, I would assume, with him about physics. So Edward Teller was obviously impressed enough by him to get him a job at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory or something like it. And then he does a series of jobs, et cetera, in other places. So this qualifies him, as things go on, to get an interview with the people who work out at Groom Lake working on experimental craft. So, and just so you know, that Groom Lake, Area 51, is a legitimate base. It wasn't known, but it is where we were working on our experimental craft. So Bob Lazar, he gets a job at Groom Lake. Now, I'm just going to talk about things that are in the timeline that are not in the new movie about Bob Lazar. And the first thing that we want to talk about, which is a very important aspect of this, is Bob's connection to John Lear. Now, John Lear is mentioned only at the end of the movie, where Bob says that he misses John, and John has passed on. I believe he passed on in 2018, and I hope I'm correct on that. But he says that he misses John Lear. And who is John Lear? John Lear is an ex-CIA pilot. If you're familiar with Air America, he originally started out with Air America, flying things into Southeast Asia. He flew into, I've listened to him talk many times. I've listened to him a lot on Project Camelot. And John talks about working on in Egypt, flying arms to different countries, et cetera, et cetera. And he had a long career flying for the CIA. So right away, we have a CIA connection Although, what is John's real role? I mean, he's ex-CIA, he's retired, he's not with them anymore, but what is his real connection to them? Well, then what is his connection to Bob Lazar? Because after Bob Lazar gets a job with Area 51 with these people, he tells John Lear, I have a job at Area 51. And so they're all happy, and this is all verifiable on YouTube. So John Lear and Bob Lazar are like in cahoots about, okay, well, what's going on out there? And I know something's going on out there. And now John Lear is also into this secret space program. And he is convinced that we have like this Phoenix sighting. He seems to think that we had, or I don't want to say past tense that we had, but I want to say past tense in reference to John, because these are the things that John claimed, that we have these massive craft that are able to fly to the moon and back, no problem, and fly. I believe he thinks we fly like intergalactically. So this is John Lear talking, and he's big, obviously into the UFO thing, and he is very good friends with a guy who is getting a job at Area 51. So all of that's very interesting, and it's very interesting that he was left out of the movie, except for that one mention of him. All right, so he's real happy to be working on the UFOs, and then according to the story, and again, not in the movie, but this is just from what John Lear or Bob Lazar says, is that the day he was shown the information and he saw the UFOs, he couldn't basically wait to go talk to John Lear. And he told him, I saw him. He told him, I saw them, and he was so excited. And so it wasn't enough for Bob Lazar to come out and break his oath of confidentiality and run to his friend who was a CIA agent, was a CIA, employee, whatever, or is he feeding information to somebody? But he says, no, I saw them. And, and maybe the CIA wants to even know what's going on in there. Maybe the CIA doesn't have a security classification to know what's going on at Area 51. That could be very implausible, fantastical. But was John Lear basically sponsoring, and Edward Teller and all them trying to get somebody, a plant, in to find out what was going on at Area 51? Now, before you scoff at this, just let me remind you that somebody has come forward, and I don't want to say the name of the person, but according to the story, he was told by President Eisenhower. Eisenhower sent him out to Area 51 and said, if you do not let me know exactly what's going on out there, I'm going to come out there and I'm going to basically bring in the Marines. I'm going to arrest everybody. And so they basically gave him some information. And I think after that, I don't know about when his encounter supposedly happened, but this happened, that a U.S. president had to send a delegate out to say, tell me what's going on out there, or I'm going to shut you all down. So this is not without precedent. But regardless of what Bob Lazar's role, a plant, whatever, the fact is he got a job. He went to work on the UFOs. He told John Lear, he broke his disclosure agreement and did it almost flippantly, like I'm, one of these leftist kind of people. And his reasons were that he thought it was unfair to the world and to the scientific community. And if you see the state of the world today, we might disagree with that first part. And the state of the scientific community, well, look how they treated him. So why would he want to share anything with them? Because obviously there is something going on within the scientific community that was out to destroy him. All right. So that is the that's the sequence of events so far. That we have a guy gets a job at Area 51. His best friend worked for the CIA, and he's telling his friend what he's doing. So, and the day that he worked, and this is according to his own story, not on the movie, but the day that he worked on UFOs, he told John Lear, yes, I saw them. I saw them today. So maybe he didn't work on them, but anyway, he said he saw them. So the next thing that happens is he contacts George Knapp. George Knapp, we all know, or most of us know, worked for a Las Vegas news station. And so a very good reporter and really nice guy, good guy. And George Knapp doesn't blow him off like everybody does. He does what you and I, or hopefully you and I would do. He said, well, this is a very incredible story, so I'm going to need some incredible proof. And so George Knapp was initially convinced enough by Bob Lazar to at least not hang up the phone on him. So what did Bob Lazar do? He takes George Knapp and he takes John Lear, and they go out to Papoose Lake. And they go out, I guess it was on a Wednesday night. And lo and behold, at the time that Bob Lazar says, I think it was 11 o'clock, the UFOs start showing up, flying over this mountain. And so they're just aghast that he would know exactly when these craft are going to come over and start doing all these amazing maneuvers, and right on the money. Well, lo and behold, it wasn't very long before the police showed up. And the police, of course, asked them for identification. And when they ran Bob Lazar's ID, well, guess what? He came up as an employee at Area 51. So now Bob Lazar is in a lot of hot water. But he had taken a television reporter out who did a story on Bob Lazar. Otherwise, Bob Lazar, the questions that I have initially are, he signed a confidentiality agreement, and most of these agreements involve prison time. So I would have to ask why he was not, put in prison for what he did. But maybe it was just because he was smart enough to get a very credible reporter to announce his story. Well, obviously, Bob Lazar loses his job, but that's not it, because he is constantly threatened, and he is shot at, and basically his life is destroyed. But the most important thing that we need to worry about here is, because this has happened to many people who have come forward. First of all, they're called a fraud by the government, right? And the next, they're crazy, right? And then the government says that, they give their account of the encounter. It was a bear, it was a, swamp gas, whatever. And it is the people who say, no, it wasn't. Well, they get the visits, right? This is where we get these visits from these government agents. And sometimes they're like men in black, who knows what they are. But the visits come when you try to go against the government's official story, when the government is lying to everyone. All right. So all these things happen to Bob Lazar, but Bob Lazar has not said that I saw a UFO flying over the trees out by my house. Bob Lazar is making a really incredible claim, and that is that he has actually worked on a UFO at a secret government installation. So immediately what happened was there was a worldwide frenzy, and this is according to George Knapp, and this is on the movie, but it was everywhere. It was in, they did a special in Japan. It was all over the world in no time. And suddenly Bob Lazar was a worldwide household name, right? But Bob Lazar is the counterintelligence, the counter information soon followed. The information followed. Bob Lazar is a fraud. Bob Lazar there's no evidence that Bob Lazar did any of the things that he said he did. Now, let's just stop for a second and reaffirm and make sure we understand that you can't get your foot in the door at Area 51 without, number one, even as a janitor, without an extensive background clearance, but to get a job working, as he said, with the propulsion system, that would require a massive or extensive education. And so how did Bob Lazar manage to get into Area 51 at all without this education? But the first thing that comes out is that Bob Lazar didn't have an education. He says he went to MIT, but his records disappeared. He said he worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. His records disappeared. Bob Lazar produced pay stubs from Area 51. He worked for the Navy. It shows his pay. He produced. There was a newspaper by I keep saying the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and I hope I'm right on that, but they did a story, front page, a story where he's talking about the rocket car that he designed, or a jet car he designed using a jet engine, which he did as like he was in high school, or he had a jet bike or something. So he's this really amazing scientist, and he obviously got a job in Area 51, but suddenly there's no record of him anywhere. And this is before, the internet. This is before Google. There's no record of him having graduated from MIT, attending MIT, or Cal Poly, something, all these places. But all these different people came forward and said, yes, he did. He did. I knew him from there. So, but in the eyes of the public, none of that mattered, because what mattered was that he was a fraud. And the public just kept being told he's a fraud, he's a fraud, he's a fraud. Now, in order to, he's not. Let me just also stop for a minute and say, what would be his motivations for doing this? And the first thing would be, of course, to get money, And so you come forward and you sell a bunch of books, et cetera, et cetera. But Bob didn't come out and write a book. He went to the television stations and said, look, you write the book, you tell the story, but we've got UFOs and I want somebody to talk about this. I want the public to know about this. So that wasn't really a way to make a lot of money. The way to make a lot of money is to write this exclusive book about it. But he didn't do that. So the only thing that he inherited from his exploits was he got a lot of fame, but he didn't get very much out of it as far as money went. So, and if you claim to be an employee of a secret government installation and you're a liar, why would you come out and say that expecting to get money from it? So there's that. All right. So the only thing that I can come up with, in my opinion, doesn't matter, but there's certain things that have to be true. Number one is he's a fraud, and why he did it was to get money. Well, he didn't get money. Number two is he says that what he says is true, and he did it to get money, and he still didn't get money. And the third one is that what he did because it's true and because he wanted people to actually know. And that's what I think a lot of people have come to the conclusion, that he just wanted people to know, because throughout every conversation he has, he says it again and again, I just wanted people to know. But people are so how they are. It is so much easier to just tear somebody down than to keep your mouth shut and listen to what they have to say and try to understand where they're coming from. If they're a fraud, they're a fraud. But if there's no proof to that effect, then something else must be true. So Next thing that happens to Bob, and let's get back onto the chronology of events here, but and I hope you understand, there had to be whatever you think is the motivation for Bob. Well, that's the truth, because that's your truth. But as far as what Bob seems to be conveying to people is that I just really wanted people to know. So a few years later, I think this was in the 90s, Bob is arrested, and he is arrested for what? Pandering. And as George Knapp says, it's not something that anybody is hardly ever charged with. They were going to send him to prison. And what pandering was apparently they were going to set up like a house of ill repute somewhere. And he had gotten involved somehow with it. And he thought it was, I guess, kind of amusing. So according to, this is all in the movie with, the new movie, is that after the lie detector test and the initial, when he came forward, the lie detector test producing all this evidence and saying, this is my reality, this is what I was doing, this is where I was, no matter what anybody else says to the contrary. So he's charged with pandering. And they ask him, okay, well, what is your background? What is your history? And he tells them. And of course, they can't find any information. The court system cannot find any information. Not only can they not find information to verify a story, but they can't find information of him having worked someplace else or having gone to some other school or having lived anywhere other than what he claimed. So what is going on there? But that was the last legal problems that Bob had before he basically just disappeared into the woodwork for about 20 some years. Now let's talk a little bit about Bob's story. If you haven't heard it, I'm going to give you kind of a summated version. It's not going to be a very long version, but I'm going to cover his story and we're going to cover the science of what he did. And I hope this is not too boring for you. But the story that Bob Lazar claims is that he went to work there. It was seriously compartmentalized, and he was given a job where he was supposed to back engineer these UFOs, their propulsion system, not the UFO, but the propulsion system. So according to his story, initially he was introduced to a lot of, I guess, pamphlets, materials, booklets that familiarized him with not only the books or the mechanics, the physics of how these things appear to be working, but with the civilizations and the people who were operating these themselves. So that was, I believe that was the day that he came to John Lear and said, I've seen them, I've seen the UFOs. So that was his, initial encounter, and he starts working with them. And what they do, or what he finds his job is that they, these UFOs, they work on the principle of gravity. So before I go any farther with gravity, let me just bring Albert Einstein into our equation very quickly. And the model that Einstein presented to the world is basically this. If you look at the Earth out in space, right, and you were to put lines of force around it like a grid, wherever the Earth is, those lines will join together. Where it's farther apart, the lines are farther apart, but that gravity condenses things, right? So if you were to push your if you were on a bed and you were to push the center of that bed down, whatever got on the bed would be subject to gravity. And so when you're out in space, you are subject to those same rules of somebody pushing that bed down, you're going to start falling down, right? So think about that principle of gravity. Gravity is simply the idea of falling down towards a mass, right? And this is something that Galileo came up with back in the 1500s, so good for him. But the idea of gravity also is relevant to, and I haven't heard anybody say this on any of these UFO shows, but it's relevant to time, right? Because as they've shown, if you get farther away from the Earth with atomic clocks, the atomic clocks go slower. And this is what Einstein said. He said that time is basically relative and that we are moving through time at a certain speed, but as an object that is moving at closer to the speed of light is going to be moving through time much more slowly than we are. So that's why they call it the theory of relativity. It has nothing to do with his E equals MC squared, but it's the fact that your time occurs according to your traveling at the speed of light. And if you want an example and you say, well, why is that important? We're not traveling at any speed of light. Well, just let me remind you that our galaxy travels around the Milky Way once every 200,000 years. And a lot of people don't understand this, but that means that the Earth and the galaxy and everything is flying through space so fast. 200,000 years is not a very long time. When the size of the galaxy, there are billions of stars in the galaxy. So in 200,000 years, we're moving all the way around and coming back to a certain point. We're just flying through space. And so that means we are moving at a certain speed relative to the speed of light, whereas another object in the middle part of the universe might not be moving so fast. So that is why gravity is important, because it has implications for time. And a lot of people don't talk about that, but I want you to understand that. So when Bob Lazar started to do his work on these, what he calls gravity amplifiers. Now, just think about that. If you can make gravity much larger, and this is what he says, going back to my analogy of the bed, is that when you can amplify the gravity in front of you, like the Earth's gravity is very weak, but just think if you can magnify that gravity to like the gravity of the sun. Just think if you could just think how fast that would pull you in, right? And how much force that would exert on you. So, and how far away that gravity would begin to exert a force on you, right? So all of those things are variables that have to do with the engines of these craft. Now, why is that important? Because if you can manipulate gravity again, you can manipulate time. So if a ship is able to suddenly disappear, it's not disappearing, it just is moving through time at a different speed. And I'm not going to go into any more than that because I do not have the sophistication to understand the physics of it. But they are basically moving in and out of the fourth dimension by being able to manipulate how they're traveling through time. And if you want to know more about that, then I have in my book, Deceptions of the Ages, I have a nice explanation about how light works and how gravity works. But and it's very simple. A child can understand it because I had to learn how to understand it. But it is very interesting, and that is the basis for how these UFOs work. And everything that Bob said was, I mean, what I'm saying to you now is known physics about gravity and about how, these are all things that science has established. So there's nothing new here. Now, what Bob basically said that, people didn't understand at the time, but that they understand now, is they're talking about this element 115. Now, I believe my atomic knowledge is not that great, but I believe that 113 and 114 are 113 is relatively stable, 114 is not very stable at all, and 115 is just an explosion. And they never had a way to stabilize this 115 element 115. But according to Bob Lazar, these UFOs had a wafer or a triangle, he says, that were used as fuel to manipulate the gravity. And if you have an atomic explosion in a jar just waiting to get out, and you can let that atomic explosion out at a slower pace. And I'm not talking about a Hiroshima or a hydrogen bomb explosion. I'm talking about creating a sun, the gravity of a sun. I'm talking about they're able to manipulate space so much that it sucks other space into it because it is so dense. So probably 10 billion times more energy than the sun, able to suck in space and take you from point A to point B, which I'll explain a little bit more in a second. But that's basically what we're talking about. We're talking about this much power in a little triangle, according to Bob Lazar. Now, has this stuff been proven? Yes, the 115 they have found that it is possible. We don't know how to do it yet, but it is possible to put this, genie, this atomic explosion in a jar, and to harness it. And so, what Bob Lazar says is that when they manufacture the stuff, they do it in wafers, and then they cut it. So it sounds to me like they are able to use it for just a little portion of it, and then not go to the next, shut it off, use it at the next one. I don't know, possibly, but this stuff is so advanced. I mean, we are trying to apply our rudimentary, very tiny knowledge of physics to people who have been doing this stuff for, maybe billions of years, that, they've got a science and a technology that, we're like ants trying to compare our little ant pile with a modern city and how it works. So that's what Bob did, and that's what Bob said, and all the things that he said about this element 115, it all became knowledge, common knowledge. And his what he talked about was, he talked about the sport model became a popular model. In fact, one of the most popular models that the tester model company sold for a long time, if not ever. So Bob Lazar became a big hit to everybody except for our government and the people at Area 51. So now I'd like to, now that you understand what we're talking about here, about the movie, about who Bob Lazar is, etc., I wanted just to give you a few of my thoughts on the movie. Now, the first thing is Mickey Rourke. I mean, come on, you can barely understand what he's saying. And Mickey, is a great actor, and I love watching him in all of his stuff, but I could hardly understand what he was saying. And I'm like, there's more than just bikers in their 70s that are going to be watching this movie. And, I don't know how many people in the UFO community are going to hear what he says, but anyway, I guess they're trying to throw in some prose, some thoughts, some deep insights into the movie. So I guess it worked a little bit, but it was just kind of weird, kind of odd. You'd probably expect to hear maybe Stephen Hawking or, somebody, but Mickey Rourke did the narration on it. So that was kind of interesting. So now the movie itself, it focused on how Bob Lazar, as I said, came forward and said, I worked on UFOs. That's it. I can tell you what I did. I can tell you what I saw. I can prove everything that I have done. I can take lie detector tests. I can do all these things to establish my credibility. And still, nobody I mean, a lot of people still call him an outright fraud. So for wanting to disclose this information. So they talk about how Bob he's still involved in science. He's working. I think he's working on a home computer or atomic. Not, I don't want to say that else. He's working on some kind of home set or something for kids, so they understand about physics and things like that. And he just talks about the effect of having years and years of being called a fraud, and all of these negative things happened to him just because he wanted people to know the truth. So it's really kind of a sad story. It made more sad by Mickey Rourke's narration, and it's kind of leaves you in a depressed mode as to the things that happened to Bob. But not only that happened to Bob, but just basically that message that I tried to help people, and look what they did to me. And is that really right for us to live in a society where we can expect and are almost, I guess, disappointed when that doesn't happen anymore, when somebody comes forward? So that's something that we need to think about. So those are my thoughts about the movie. And again, I thought it was very interesting that John Lear was not mentioned in the movie except at the end. And they completely left the part out about, Bob getting a job at Area 51, and then disclosing to John Lear what he was not supposed to disclose. And if John Lear is still working with somebody at the CIA or contacting somebody, he's passing that information on. So he could have got Bob Lazar in a lot of trouble anyway. But first of all, Bob Lazar broke his confidentiality agreement. So that is something that was not mentioned in the movie. And as I said, they only mentioned John Lear at the end of the movie, that Bob missed John. And there was no mention of him taking George Knapp and John Lear to Papoose Lake. And the reason that I think that this is important is because there's an element of Bob that is he's a I don't want to say a troublemaker, but there is an element to Bob that he's a rebel, that he has the idea that there are certain ways that things should be done, and that it has to be Bob's way or it's ridiculous. And they had a lot of things going on at Area 51, and he knew he was going to get in trouble. And his whole idea of, if I just make this a publicly known thing as fast as possible, then there will be no repercussions for me. And I just don't know what the thought process was, but for him to be doing that, and another thing, well, it just kind of makes you look at Bob has maybe a questionable personality. And then you would, of course, well, we got to verify what he says. So, but there were some interesting things in that movie that I said, well, why isn't John Lear? Why doesn't he make a bigger presence here? The next thing that I think that Bob Lazar kind of did was the way that he drove around in a Corvette and whatever, and kind of to try to be like this flashy person, and that was kind of to his detriment. So I think that Bob Lazar kind of created his own reality, and they don't talk about, sure, it's great, it's a very noble thing that he did, but the way that he went around it or went about it was probably questionable. And I'm sure that he thought, well, they can't wipe my past out, but they found out that they did. So The last thing that I want to point out to people that I think is very important is that Bob Lazar had a job where he was doing something that millions, maybe 1 billion people on this planet would love to have. He was going to be able to back engineer a spacecraft from other planets, other civilization. He was going to be able to get to know more than anybody knew, unless they decided at some point to take him out for knowing too much. But Bob Lazar was going to have the dream job of working with other civilizations, craft, and who knows, maybe even with other civilizations. He had the opportunity to come to an understanding of our place in the universe, and maybe he would have encountered other beings. Maybe he would have come across other knowledge. Maybe he would have found other people that were sympathetic to him. But he didn't spend enough time to get any more information. And so I find that, if you're looking at it as, well, if it was me, then I would say I would have stayed there for a little while longer, and I would have seen what else there was to see. Now, there's one other thing in the movie that I'd like to talk about briefly, and that is Bob says that at one point he was walking past a door on his way to his 9 alien spacecraft, and he happened to just glance. There were big windows on the doors he was walking past, and he saw a small being sitting in a chair, and his first impression was that was an alien. And so I don't know what his initial story was, but on the movie, he says, I don't know what it was. He says, I think it was a model of an alien. And why would he say that? He can just say, well, I think it could have been an alien. But he's very quick to point out that I don't know what it was. And because if I say it's an alien, that's a massive, claim to have. And he just points out it was a very brief encounter, and then it was over, and I don't know what it was, but it looked like it could have been an alien. It could have been a model of an alien. And then he gives this story about how they could have been fitting this doll or whatever into the seats of the craft to see how big these things were. So any of these stories could be true, and also that could have been an actual alien. But he was very careful not to extrapolate and say it was something that he didn't know what it was. And so I think that's it goes a long way towards understanding not only his situation but his. If it were you and I would say, it's probably an alien, Yeah, we would say that. We don't, probably. It doesn't mean it really was, but he goes on to say that it's not. I'm pretty sure it wasn't. All right, so this person had an experience. And it was a very, 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 how shall I say, I don't want to say traumatic, but this is the kind of experience that you're never going to forget for the rest of your life. And people do different things with knowledge and experience they have. Some people want to keep that knowledge to themselves. Other people want to share that knowledge and add to the knowledge that people have of the world. And people who call themselves teachers and people who call themselves scientists, that's what they do. That's what's important to them. So when scientists, and we're talking about the people involved in what's going on at Groom Lake and Area 51 and S4, et cetera, but when scientists come out and call somebody a fraud, and they call somebody whatever they do to protect their knowledge, to protect their source of income, to do whatever they do, unfortunately, it happens all the time. And the reason it does is because the government gives them a salary, or a university gives them a salary, or an agency gives them a salary. And that salary is guaranteed if they will come out and discredit what anybody says that is not the government and science's version of the truth. And that's it. You cannot talk about things in the scientific community that are not accepted. And if you do, you will not be in the scientific community for very long. This is what's very important about what happened to Bob Lazar, because it happens to everybody. It happens on an almost daily basis. So another thing that we need to look at is when Bob Lazar was going through all of this trauma, no politician came forward and backed him and said, no, I want to get behind this. Why is that? Why are politicians so afraid of the people at Area 51 that they don't want to even bother with it? Now, the only reason we even found out about Area 51 is because a couple of workers were killed, and a few in an explosion. And I think Bob Lazar talked about that. But a couple of workers were killed, and a few of them got sick because they were handling toxic materials, and they sued the government because they were sick. And in the lawsuit, it said exactly where they were working and disposing of these toxic chemicals. So that is how the government came to know, and the people came to know, there really was an Area 51 and an S4. So all of these things came forward to prove that Bob Lazar was right about everything that he said. All these things came forward about everything he said. But because the papers never came forward and said he's right, what he says is correct, only George Knapp and a few other reporters came forward and said, I believe what this guy has to say. All the scientific community tried to destroy him. The government tried to destroy him, kill him in some cases, but you can kill somebody financially and it's the same thing. So all of these people tried their best to attack this man because he wanted to bring out more knowledge to the people. If that does not frighten you, then you do not deserve to live in a democracy where we depend on the guy next to us to tell us the truth. We depend on the politician and the government and the guy selling arms and the lawyer and the mayor. We expect them to tell the truth. And when we have a culture of lies and we expect to be lied to, then our society is not going to last anymore, or it's certainly not going to last very long. Now, there are some things that have changed since Bob Lazar has come forward. Bigfoot, UFOs, alien encounters, those have all become mainstream topics. And I want to say mainstream, but almost mainstream, because the litmus test is this. When you go to your job, your next job, the job you have now, do you want them to know that you saw Bigfoot? Do you want them to know that you filed a report with MUFON about a UFO you saw, outside of your house? Do you want to talk about something you heard in the woods while you were camping and it scared you to death because you've never heard anything like that? Do you want to tell them that you are involved with groups that believe these people exist or these things exist? Or do you want to just stay away from that? Because you know that based on how the government has conditioned people and how the media has conditioned people to laugh about it and to make jokes about it. And the first thing you do is say, oh, one of those, right? And oh, a conspiracy theorist. Well, that's the easiest, most simple thing to do because there's no thinking involved. And until we can get human beings to start thinking and stop listening to what the government, whose benefit is to make you see things the way they want you to see them, until we come to that reality and accepting that there is a greater truth out there than the government is ever going to let on, and that they're never, ever going to officially disclose anything about a Bigfoot, about a dogman, about a UFO, or alien civilizations, until you come to that, acceptance, then you're going to have a very difficult time understanding what is going on, because, my friends, that's not going to happen. All right, so I think we're going to call that a podcast for today. For myself, I'm Matthew Hines, and hopefully we'll get Tony back for the next podcast. We really missed him today. And don't forget, on Tuesday, Diet is going to be with us to do some remote viewing of some targets we've given her in the Hudson Valley. So, exciting stuff coming up. Don't forget, if you'd like to comment on our podcasts, on our topics, if you have any input, then please do so. You can do so on YouTube, on our podcast on YouTube, and you can also do so on iTunes, and on both of those channels, you can subscribe. And don't forget, we're available on Spotify, radio.com, Stitcher, iTunes, Google+, and iHeartRadio, and I hope I didn't repeat any. So that is our podcast for today. And I'd like to thank you guys out there for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this information is good for you. And again, if you want to support the podcast, look for our subscribe on Patreon or on iTunes, or go ahead and look for us at patreon.com/hindsight, or check out one of my great books. I've written 7 of them, so check out hindsight.com. But if you want to know anything more about our future encounters episodes, past encounters episodes, or if you would like to come on the show and talk about an encounter that you had, we would sure love to have you. So contact us at encountersusa1@gmail.com. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up the show. So remember, friends, if you're out in the woods this summer, always watch your back.